Before we actually kick off, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we're all joining from today. I pay respect to elders past, present and future by recognising the deep history, ecological knowledge and the critical role of Indigenous people globally in a sustainable and equitable future for all. My name's Tanya Harris. I'm a procurement practitioner with over 20 years experience in the private and international development sectors, having worked across 25 different countries. 15 of those years are in sustainability. I sit on various national and international committees. Some of those include the Sustainable Procurement Guidance ISO 2400 International Steering Committee, the Australian Government consultation to develop Australia's Modern Slavery Act, and a couple of different United Nations consortiums. I also have the pleasure of leading the Sustainable and Ethical Procurement team here at Edge Impact. Edge is a multidisciplinary independent sustainability consultancy. We support clients to increase their positive impact using science, strategy and storytelling across Australia, New Zealand, United States and Latin America. Our vision is to create a world where the unsustainable is unthinkable. One of the ways in which we do that is by partnering with fantastic organisations like Supply Shift, who are joining us today. So without further ado, I would like to jump straight into what is modern slavery. So modern slavery, one sec, excuse me. Modern slavery, when we talk about modern slavery or human rights, businesses can draw on, but what is modern slavery? Modern slavery is the severe exploitation of other people for personal or commercial gain. It's an umbrella term for some of the most severe human rights abuses, including forced labour, the worst forms of child labour, human trafficking, and debt bondage. You can see here some pretty serious statistics. It's a serious issue that's gaining increasing global attention. The urgency is typified in the last few years by reporting from the ILO, the International Labour Organization, which identifies that there are currently 49.6 million people in modern slavery conditions globally. Let's just pause. That's almost 50 million people are estimated to be in modern slavery right now. That's more than at the time of abolition in 1865. And that means that there is now one slave for every 165 people in the world. Increasing conflicts, COVID and climate change have disproportionately affected vulnerable communities. And based on the previous study, we're losing ground at an alarming rate. So why does this happen? In many industries, including the legal sector, this occurs due to complex structure of supply chain. We know that supply chains are global. Multiple suppliers and subcontractors are involved, making it difficult to monitor and address exploitative practices. However, the production of goods, such as branded products, often relies on low-skilled and low-paid workers, and that includes migrant or transitional workers. These individuals are much more vulnerable to exploitation due to their limited legal rights, language barriers, and limited access to information and support. The high demand for goods drives down prices, which is often a buying function, leading to cost-cutting measures that can result in exploitative practices, including forced labour. Adding to the challenge is the lack of transparency in industry, making it hard to trace the origins of materials, ensure ethical and sustainable production practices. This lack of transparency further compounds the issue. Legislation is being deployed globally to be able to address this complex issue. So I would like to, first of all, introduce and we'll hand over to our first panellist, Patrick, if you don't mind introducing yourself.
Thanks, Tanya. I appreciate it. And thanks for that nice introduction on the problem that we're facing with respect to modern slavery and some of the other worst forms of human rights abuses in the global supply chain. My name is Patrick Miller. I'm the founding attorney of Impact Advocates. This is a law firm where we focus on working with social impact companies and other traditional businesses, helping them make positive social impact. One of the main areas of practice we focus on is international arbitration and other forms of international dispute resolution. So that's in the context of global business, commercial relationships, contract breaches, joint venture failures, partnership disputes, things of that nature. I spent the first decade of my career living abroad in Europe and Asia, focused on working on these types of international commercial disputes. And then when I founded Impact Advocates in 2020, I wanted to focus on particularly continuing to work with global businesses, but focusing on helping these global businesses make positive social impact. So we do a lot of work with B Corps, benefit companies, and companies like that are keenly interested in ensuring that their supply chain practices are responsible. And when we started, the focus was to work with some of the outliers in the industry, some of the leaders like B Corps benefit companies. But as we progressed over the past few years, you see the development of these national regulatory regimes focused on responsible supply chains. And thank you, Nick, for shifting me right to the different legislative landscape around the world. You can see just over the past few years, the various human rights due diligence legislation. I think we didn't even get the chance to fill in the latest Canada. Oh, we did get the Canada Forced Labor Act right there. We have the Japan Act, the Thailand Act. You can see all around the world these different regulatory regimes where some are focused on reporting, so reporting on the type of responsible sourcing frameworks you have in place as a company, whereas others are focused on more strict liability regimes, which is more results oriented as far as did you import from these specific regions. So the two main buckets you could say would be areas like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is obviously an area that I focus on primarily. Keeping in mind that we have an international audience, I guess I should mention that I'm a US lawyer based in Los Angeles. So a large number of my clients are US based, and for that reason, they need to be aware of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. But we also have the California Transparency Supply Chains Act, which is a reporting regime. And then also there's plenty of companies where even if they're a US or a company that's incorporated in a jurisdiction that doesn't necessarily require reporting, they might have counterparties that do business in areas where they do require reporting. So there's a network of different regulatory regimes, which all comes from the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which basically focuses on human rights due diligence and remediation as core tenets. And the idea is essentially that the era of ignorance is over. What I like to say is 5 years ago, you could get away with telling regulators or telling the public our supply chain is just too opaque, it's too multi-layered, it's too complicated, we just don't understand what's going on. Now, regulators understand that this is a difficult task, but it's one that companies increasingly are going to have to take on. And so I, along with my colleagues, have been a part of helping companies to do just that. And with that in mind, let me transfer it over to Indrani. I think I'm transferring it over to Indrani, or maybe I'll be transferring.
I'll go first if that's okay, Patrick. Thank you for that. My name is Nick Dexter. I work alongside Tanya Harris at Edge Impact here in Sydney, Australia. My career's been fairly multifaceted. Spent a fair bit of time as a procurement manager doing procurement proper for a New Zealand-based chemistry company, and transitioned from that role to looking at deep supply chain analysis alongside a Kiwi startup called Oratane that uses chemistry and statistics to prove the origin of goods. So particularly relevant, I guess, to those models that really require an evidence base to show that your sourcing is not from areas of concern. In the last year, I've joined Edge Impact, and now I assist companies in defining and achieving their sustainability activities, particularly with respect to human rights and modern slavery. The S of the SG is really my jam. It's both my professional focus and a bit of a passion space. I don't think that anyone gets into sustainability and just does it as their day job. In fact, my first WhatsApp message this morning was from a friend of mine in the US who was telling me that he'd always thought of my job as one of these Silva jobs, one of these very new age roles created out of social justice. But he's traveling in Massachusetts and sent me a photo from a church there, where in 1830, an abbot was educating his parishioners, I guess, on the impacts of supply chains and encouraging them not to buy cotton products because of its links to modern slavery in the US. So, very typical given this morning's topic and this morning's audience. Building on what Patrick was just telling us, the legislative landscape really is complex, but legislators on the whole have actually not been overly creative. A common framework for compliance on most models is the UNGPs. This is a globally recognized standard for addressing human rights issues in the context of business operations, and they serve to provide guidance on responsible business conduct, corporate social responsibility, and the protection of human rights in the context of economic activities. The UNGPs consist of 31 principles, and they're organized under 3 pillars. I'm not going to overwhelm you with all of them today, but I do want to talk about just 2. UNGP 11 states that businesses should avoid infringing on the human rights of others and should address adverse human rights impacts with which they are involved. And UNGP 13 says that business enterprises have a responsibility to respect human rights, and that this has 2 key components. First, to avoid causing or contributing to adverse human rights impacts through their own activities. And secondly, they should seek to prevent or mitigate adverse human rights impacts that are directly linked to their operations, even if they have not contributed to those impacts. This is really important in the context of the UFLPA. Most organizations are not directly employing people in the Uyghur region. Most organizations are purchasing from organizations that through their sourcing practices are linked to the Uyghur region. Collectively, these 2 UNGPs form the basis of a corporate responsibility to respect human rights, to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for adverse human rights impacts. You need to employ what we refer to as due diligence processes. This comprises of 3 key elements: assessing the actual and potential human rights impacts of your activities and supply chains. This really means conducting a risk assessment to clearly understand what problems you need to solve and where that problem exists. There are a number of tools that you can use to achieve this, from working with an organization such as Edge or a free source platform such as Nomagaya. But whatever model you use, it is really important to know that it is data evidenced and that is making use of current comprehensive data sets. It's really important that you clarify that all you have done so far is understand what problem you are trying to solve. A risk assessment is not due diligence. A risk assessment tells you where you need to apply due diligence. You then need to integrate the learning from your risk assessment and act on its findings. We've got forced labor over here. How are we going to address that? And you can do that for a number of models, but it needs to be contextual. If your risk is with your tier 1 supplier, you need to engage with your tier 1 supplier. If your risk is with your tier N supplier, really deep in your supply chain, then you may need to have as a first activity vertical mapping, or you may need to employ a tool that links your imports directly back to that origin. And finally, you need to put in place a comprehensive effectiveness measurement system that transparently reports on your progress to maintain accountability internally and momentum. and remembering that what gets measured gets managed. So making sure that you have a set of effectiveness measurement tools that are pointing in the right direction, that are routinely managed, that you can monitor your progress over time. Addressing modern slavery risk requires a really deep understanding of your supply chain. Firstly, you need to know the players in the supply chain through targeted mapping based on the supply chains that contain your most salient human rights risks. And secondly, the practices undertaken within those organizations. Gathering this data requires considerable effort, and it takes effort both on your part and on the part of your supply chain. This is exacerbated by a challenge that obtaining this data requires a lot of effort in terms of formulating your questions and in your supplier's ability to respond to those questions. And it's exacerbated by a challenge that each customer is asking for very similar data, but in disparate ways and using slightly different language to explain their expectations. But what if there was a different way? The solution to these challenges really does lie in collaboration. We were really proud to support the Property Council of Australia in assisting in the design of an industry risk assessment tool with a consistent supplier questionnaire. This has many advantages to the industry. Firstly, through aligned expectations, terminology, and requirements, you eliminate the confusion arising from disparate data sets. Suppliers can respond efficiently and encourages enhanced engagement. That standardization of data improves accuracy and reliability, which ultimately leads to better informed decision making. And on that note, I will hand over to Indrani.
What a great segue. Thank you so much, Nick. Hi, everyone. My name's Indrani de Silva. Welcome. We are delighted at Supply Shift to be co-hosting the webinar with our partners, Edge Impact. I am the Sustainability Solutions Advisor for Supply Shift. I'm based in New York City, and I work globally with our customers across a diverse set of industries and sectors. A little bit about my background. I come with over 15 years of experience in implementing responsible sourcing solutions within the apparel and footwear industry, as well as electronics, at the intersection of business and human rights, working alongside companies and their counterparts in sustainability and procurement to work towards responsible sourcing practices. So I'm delighted to be here. In my role at Supply Shift, I help companies evaluate their sustainability performance by leveraging Supply Shift's technology to ensure greater transparency and supply chain visibility. If you could go to the next slide, please, Nick. Thank you. So as we heard from Edge Impact and earlier from Tanya, who created and really brought this problem, understanding the problem to light, right? Modern slavery is a global issue. And while we have such an international crowd, I wanted to be very inclusive and also remind us of these two, drill down a little bit on these two particular statistics representing G20 countries. So G20 scope of modern slavery. In 2021, G20 countries imported $468 billion US dollars worth of goods at risk of modern slavery. Now, I want to emphasize here, it is $468 billion worth of, and not $468. That's an omission of a B that will be put back in on this slide when you get them after the call. So here, this statistic from the Global Slavery Index 2023 illustrates that modern slavery and human trafficking are also lucrative for bad actors in the supply chain. Human exploitation has become the next pervasive criminal economy in the world. So this was mentioned earlier, but there is a significant economic opportunity that bad actors are participating in. So we need to be mindful of that as well. And of the 50 million that Tanya pointed out earlier, living in conditions of modern slavery, Over 1.1 million in the United States are estimated to be living in conditions of modern slavery. Further to that, in the UK, 122,000 people are living in modern slavery conditions. Okay, if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what I wanted to just close off, actually, if you could go back one more time, Nick, I just wanted to close off with that slide. And I didn't mean to jump ahead, is I want to say that this is a global problem, and it's something that we are all have a opportunity to support figuring out how we can resolve and how we can work together to collaborate. So being mindful that this spans many industries, specifically, it's often spoken in construction, it's often pointed out in other areas of hospitality, domestic service, but it's not specific just to those industries. Agriculture, we see a high prevalence of it there. So it's important to note where these do appear. Okay, if we could go to the next one, thank you. All right, so the approach with our technology at Supply Shift. And one thing I want to say here is that technology, there are many technologies out there. Technology has brought us together in many ways and has helped aid a lot of our connection to suppliers and our supply chains. And it's how we can use it to best ensure transparency. So mapping and assessing beyond tier 1 is critical. It's a critical component of a human rights program. We recommend at Supply Shift a risk-based approach to go beyond tier 1. And this is similar, just building up of what Nick had said earlier about really having a comprehensive understanding of your supply chain, that much of the first step starts with assessment and assessing who and what is in your supply chain. So our approach is particularly helps with you uncover hidden risks, which exists further upstream in buyers' supply chains, practices that may be connected to the use of child labor, forced labor, unfair recruitment practices. The hidden risks are often represented by suppliers who are not necessarily your strategic suppliers or your highest volume or spend suppliers. In fact, they're smaller suppliers that may be representative of intermediary processes related to raw material extraction, for instance, if you're a mining company. So it's harder and harder to get clarity on those opaque spots, those blind spots in your supply chain, without having an effective technology tool which can help you to really uncover those spots and forecast and anticipate where there's going to be issues. So those are important things to point out from a tech, how technology can really help and build transparency. With our assessments, what we found, we can be able to forward these assessments. So we have the product capability in this particular solution, and we work very closely with Edge Impact also as the tech component with our combined customers to really support them holistically. So building off of what Nick said about assessments, the actual assessments are the heart of our solution. So with that, we have smart built assessments that allow you to forward them on to your supplier, then your supplier's supplier, and your supplier's supplier, right? So on the right, you can see an illustration of this network effect, which is a key product capability of Supply Shift's technology. So it really allows you the ease, the efficiency, and the consistent, reliable, standardized process in order to get accurate data. And as Nick said, and as it was mentioned by Tanya as well, and I'm sure we'll talk about further, that data, accurate data, directly impacts how you are able to address human rights violations within your supply chain. So you want to really have an excellent foundation for that from the beginning. Also, our solution allows you to reduce audit fatigue for both suppliers and buyers by allowing you to collect and analyze necessary data. Again, with our tool, one of the things is that data information's harmonized. It creates aggregate data and analysis, so companies can quickly be able to see an overview of their risk exposure within their supply chain. So lastly, a wonderful piece about sort of the side panel on this on the slide deck is that our solution helps to foster collaboration. And this is very much why we're on this panel with Edge Impact. We have a lot of partners in our ecosystem, and when we have a real wonderful fondness and connection to Edge Impact, because we share, even though we're across many continents, there are a lot of similarities on salient issues of human rights risk that we're all here today to learn from each other. And so one of the things that this tool does is allow you internally in your teams to do something similar, to actually work with procurement, marketing, sales, business development, procurement, logistics, and see the same data across divisions in order to make an informed decision about your sourcing and procurement. So this is a benefit to drive not only and share data, but to drive impact, real impact. And on the right here, you'll see this illustration, which is an illustration to show what our network, our capabilities in particular, are known for, which is the multi-tier and the multi-tenant. So the multi-tier being, you can go further down the supply chain, and while there's risks further up, you can actually be able to see much more visibility. So multi-tier is essential for seeing that visibility further down the supply chain, or further up the supply chain, sorry. And then the next thing is multi-tenant. That means you can send and share data, and suppliers can share to many buyers, not just one buyer. So therefore, again, you have the efficiency, the effectiveness, and you can get to solving the problems and spend more time on that. So thank you for moving, Nick. This is great. Okay, so now we're talking about the journey and the building blocks. You know, our customers say, where do we start? How do we do this? And Nick just set up for us. And I'm saying Nick because you just went before me, Nick, but you just set up nicely sort of the assess, the integrate, right? The 3 steps, and then to really understand and track progress. So the first step here in this journey is really to be able to understand who your suppliers are and what they're doing, right? And then secondly, in this next step on managing risk is to, now you've seen where your risk is. So now you can dig deeper and maybe conduct an audit assessment, maybe go further and also conduct further self-assessments so that you can bring to light where and who you need to specifically work with continuous improvement on, what areas of that. So then you go to engaging suppliers and tracking. This tool allows you with corrective action tools to directly speak with your supplier, two-way communication, which allows you to then track progress, areas of improvement, co-create plans for how they can better address your targets and expectations and meet their own, in fact, too. And then on the 4th step here is integrate access across your business. So that allows you, I mentioned before, this networked effect of being able to have a dashboard that shows other divisions, business divisions, and then allows you to use data from SupplyShift that's integrated into your RPM systems or your particular suite of procurement systems, internal controls that you already have. The data from us can then be fed into those systems so that you can more smoothly and accurately make your decisions efficiently on sourcing. And then, of course, driving impact. So all of this being a coordinated, sustainable supply chain journey to be able to create impact. At SupplyShift, we know that sustainable supply chains is a journey. And we understand that collecting data and having solid, accurate data is key for procurement and sustainability professionals to be successful. If you could move on, that'd be great. Thank you. So I want to thank everybody and appreciate so much you're listening to us all so far. Looking forward to the questions and inviting anybody to reach out and contact me and our team if you'd like to learn more about how we and technology can better support your sustainability goals. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Patrick Nick and Indrani. I hope that was as useful for everybody on the call as it is for me to be able to also hear and to confirm really from our side that the way that you address human rights issues is actually similar or the same across the world by using the principles of the UN GC. So maybe rather than, I do have a couple of questions, but there's been 3 that have come through via the chat and Q&A related to risk, and I think that that's really the burning question. And I might actually start with the first one that came through. I think that's really really relevant and very useful for us to be able to kickstart the conversation, which is, how do you measure risk when identifying potential risks? Is it more geared towards risk of possible human rights violations or risk to the business if the supplier is found to be guilty of abuses and forced out of business? So there's a couple in there. I think I might start with, how do you actually measure risk when identifying potential risks? And is it risk to business or people? Who on the panel would like to go first? Patrick?
Yeah, sure. I think this is a lot of what I do. A large part of what Edge Impact and Supply Shift do is implement the strategies to address risk that lawyers like me will identify. So we'll say to you, this is your regulatory jurisdiction, and this is what you need to do to be in compliance with the jurisdiction. You also need to think about the potential litigation risk, the potential business disruption risk, reputational risk, all of those different things. So to answer your question specifically, Patrick, the answer is both. So to conduct proper human rights due diligence, you should focus on the risk to the person, to the potentially affected stakeholders. So that's either the supplier's employees, other potentially affected, say if there's a community that might be affected by environmental issues around the suppliers. So to conduct proper human rights due diligence in compliance with the UNGPs and the various legislative regulatory regimes, you certainly have to focus on that. But in doing so, you'll also be thinking through, well, how does this affect my business risk? So the idea is, you shouldn't just cut and run with the idea that you can extricate yourself of business risk by cutting out that supplier from your supply chain. Because the modern approach is to say, rather than just irresponsibly exiting from that supplier, you should work to remediate the issues in the supplier. So I think that kind of tees it up a little bit, and maybe Nick or Indrani want to supplement that a bit.
Yeah, I guess to build on that, the foundation really is the risk to people and focusing on your most salient risks. So that being scope, scale, remediability. So scope, how many people are affected? Scale, how are they affected? How serious are they being affected? And remediability, what can you actually do about it? And so using those 3 lenses, we have different data that can input into that. How many people are affected is both a factor of the likelihood due to geographic and industry risk, and the amount of spend that you're doing in a particular category. Scale, we've got data sets that can help understand what is the impact to people. And remediability, you're really looking at what is your leverage, what is your relationship to that risk, using the UNGP framework of cause, contribute, directly linked. If you're addressing what is the risk to people, then you are looking under the hood at what is the risk to business due to that legislative framework. I think that that's been a really interesting evolution of the maturity of responses to corporate responsibility legislation. That initially there was this real rush to, okay, the UFLPA says that they're focusing on cotton, polysilicates, and tomatoes. I'm not in those industries. Wonderful, job done, move on. What we're now seeing through the extended lens of application of that legislation is that businesses, certainly I think a lot of businesses took note when aluminium was put in there. We went, oh, hang on, I didn't know that that was a core product from the Uyghur region. And we had a lot of other businesses say, actually, we need to go back to basics because that lens could shift. And I need to know what is the risk to people because that directly impacts the risk to business. And Tanya, I know that you're a real risk nerd. And so in that fun of risk allocation, risk domain allocation has actually been quite interesting to see a lot of this sat in third-party environmental risk. And now it's actually, this is an operational risk. If I can't get this product into the United States to my manufacturing facilities or to my customer, then that actually affects my ability to do business. Indrani or Tanya, I'm sure that you both have perspectives that you'd like to build on there.
Sure, I'll just add both Patrick and Nick, you emphasized quite a few good points, starting with it's important to look at both sides of what I think is the same coin fundamentally. But I'd also say, in keeping with the theme of this webinar and really understanding the evolving legislation landscape and looking at double materiality, talking about, material, what is material to your business, what is material to impacting stakeholders. There is more and more of an emphasis actually for the EU reporting standards directive and the supply chain directive to be able to look at both those aspects. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for learning. There's a tremendous amount of information out there also for companies to understand how to do this double materiality and understand what that actually means. So, that's something that we work with partners as well to do, like yourselves. But I think it is important to have a lens to both and not sort of equate priorities one over the other, because actually when you'll be able to interconnect them, I think you'll have a much more effective and efficient response. Be more prepared.
Absolutely. Tanya. Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe just to close out and perhaps move to the next question related to risk. As a practitioner, in simplistic kind of terms, in the way that we approach risk assessment is credible sources of truth. So first of all, we apply a risk lens to our categories of spend, understanding the country of origin in which the products or services are being sourced from, using credible databases as well as media, so where there's been prosecution, and associate those risks at a category level. And then we look at individual risk at that supplier level. So it's actually risk is iterative, which is why it's super interesting. Once you understand your risk, you've set your internal goalposts, and therefore the way that you engage with those categories and those suppliers is informed by that risk allocation. If there's controls in place at that supply chain level and governance level, then the risk allocation can be modified based on those controls. So that's how we prioritize risk. Risk is very interesting. If you understand your risks, you can transform them into positive opportunities. So I might move on to the next question, which is how can we, and this is actually a little bit of a tricky one, so I'll be interested to see how the panel would like to answer this. How can we better identify risks that have less transparent issues around sexual harassment that perhaps don't regularly show up in assessments, and potentially what would mitigation measures look like?
Happy to jump in here. I think we're living in a really exciting time when it comes to human rights. We talk about these macro trends of increasing transparency and decreasing trust. Alongside this macro trend of increasing transparency is this proliferation of wonderful tools that allow us to understand what's really going on. And we've spent a lot of time talking about that understanding of where your products are coming from, but perhaps we haven't talked enough about what does it mean to understand the lived experiences of the people working within those supply chains, which is really at the heart of the problem, right? And so these less transparent issues like sexual harassment, I think really do need to come into this domain of worker voice. And there's a wonderful suite of tools available to allow organizations to listen to worker voice through anonymous platforms that are providing targeted data back to you to allow you to understand what does it actually mean for a person to be working in these types of facilities. There are a number, one of which being millionmakers.org, which if you're not familiar with, I would strongly encourage you to have a look at. Full disclosure, in my not-for-profit life, I have a relationship with that organization. So I'm familiar with it, is why I mention it, not necessarily because it's the only tool there. So there are other tools like it. What does mitigation measures look like? It's always going to come back to that contextualization of what is the problem that you're trying to solve. At the heart of it, it's going to need to be collaboration with parties on the ground. That includes partners in the not-for-profit sector, but it also includes direct engagement with your supply chain, if it is safe to do so. Keeping in mind that when we're talking about these types of challenges, the individual rights holder comes first, that all of your activities should be about protecting those individuals, and your activities really need to honour that. Patrick, you've gone off mute. Do you want to go?
I just had to kind of, you really targeted this from a large 20,000 feet. And I just wanted to say one tactic that I've heard that's particularly useful is in the context of sexual violence issues, given that it's tremendously culturally idiosyncratic. Similarly with sexual harassment issues, from a legal perspective, it depends on the jurisdiction and all those things. Putting that to one side, let the stakeholder decide what they feel is problematic. And the best way to do that is to give, when you have trainings or any type of awareness trainings to indicate that there are these reporting systems in place, you would also allow for the people that are doing the training to also be the people that are receiving the reports. You want the people receiving the reports to be trusted intermediaries by the stakeholders. You don't want them to be a representative of Gap or whatever company. You want them to be, ideally, a local NGO or some type of group that the stakeholders trust that they'll report to. That's just a small point.
Yeah. Thank you. Indrani, did you want to jump in?
Sure, yeah. So one thing I thought of when this question came to mind was, and I think Nick and Patrick touched upon it, so I'm going to try and sort of combine all those aspects, is there is not one single solution. There is no simple and clear measure of social impact of supply chains. And it really is about a blended approach. So that blended approach combining on-site social audits, tools in on-site social audits, you're talking self-built self-assessments, smartly built self-assessments. You're also talking country risk analysis, regional risk analysis, all these to be a part of the practitioners and the procurements team sustainability toolkit. And with that, as Patrick said, this is from my social compliance days experience on auditing. One of the key drivers that we see certainly, and that we try and pay attention to in this particular issue, I think with harassment, is you want to see if you're having these conversations, you're doing these on-site interviews, what is the language? What is the behavioral language you're reading and how is it coming across, right? So you want to make sure, to Patrick's point, you want to make sure that there's a trust built there with who that person is in that role asking the question, that it's confidential, that they're able to communicate feedback about the behavior of the of the nature of the engagement so that you can get some real experience and feedback locally, and working with NGOs. I mean, again, it's a collaborative experience. That on the ground cultural competency is key to making sure we're interpreting what we're seeing accurately for the benefit of workers, and promoting them and promoting it that way too. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It is a collaboration. It's a multi-stakeholder, multi-actor approach, and I think that that's a really key message for anybody that is looking to engage and have positive impact, is that you can't do it alone, and it is also culturally contextual. So I think we've got time for one more question or two more questions. I might merge Bonnie and Cassandra's question, which is around how is so it's around the tools to be able to engage. So what are mechanisms around to be able to action auditing and monitoring systems to validate supplier information with COVID and impacts about being able to do site inspections being impacted? You know, what are the mechanisms to be able to undertake on the ground?
So I guess I could start, because one thing I really like talking about, which hopefully won't bore everyone, and I'll try to talk quickly, is the Model Contract Clause project I'm involved with through the American Bar Association. We developed a set of model contract clauses to protect human rights and supply chains. You can put these clauses in your supply contracts. They're formulated based on the UNGPs. They effectively operationalize the UNGPs, particularly the human rights due diligence and remediation aspects of the UNGPs. The reason why I talk about that is obviously it's a pet project of mine, but also because when you have contractual arrangements in place, the process of negotiating those contractual arrangements allows you to have a realistic understanding of what's achievable on the ground. And if you incorporate a structure like the model contract clauses, where the identification of a human rights issue doesn't necessarily trigger a breach and consequent damages right away, but rather triggers a dispute resolution mechanism that allows for remediation of the problem, you're much more likely to discover problems. So it's a more fluid contractual arrangement, but it's still formalized and it's still operationalized. So that's one point that I wanted to bring up. Maybe Nick or Indrani have a little bit to add, so I'll defer to them.
Happy to jump in here. I guess at the front end of both these questions is around this progress through the pandemic. Pre-pandemic, we really saw boots on the ground approach, right? That best practice looked like you put a person into this facility and you had a look around. What we know from social audits is that methodology provides more comfort than perhaps than it should. That we know that it's a relatively false engagement, this idea of a social audit. When you go in, the facility knows whether it's an announced audit or an unannounced audit, that you are there. And so what you are seeing is in some shape able to be controlled. The people you speak to, if you are having a good worker voice engagement as part of that social audit, may also be controlled. What you are privy to seeing in terms of their living arrangements, all of this type of stuff. During the pandemic, we really saw a bit of a switch, right? That brands couldn't get in to oversee what these social audits look like. And we saw an improvement in partnerships. And when we talk about boots on the ground, just having a look at that partnership suite, I think, is really so important in this space. That understanding what does good look like in this country, in this community. The not-for-profit sector, I think, has a really big step up on corporate actors in that space, and an ability to engage with workers in a slightly different way. So I really do want to call out that opportunity for engagement at a broader level, both within your industry, but also with the not-for-profit sector to get more of that contextual information back up and through. Certainly third-party audits still have a really strong place to play, but just making sure that it's contextualized. Indrani.
Yeah, I wanted to add, especially with I think, there was a question that was floating here about how have things gotten worse or better. And I think in terms of modern slavery, and I think with COVID, this we can't not mention, right? As you mentioned, Nick, certainly certain aspects of being able to monitor and secure knowledge and understand what's going on the ground has been very challenging. So one of the reasons that I think technology here has a great opportunity to help facilitate data assurance and verification. This is a part of our product capability and supply shift that we're able to actually verify documentation and provide that assurance through the supplier assessments. And we also are able to have auditors be in reviewing the supplier information as well as another check. So there's many opportunities where you actually can take advantage of the connectivity in a very real-time opportunity to see what the challenges are and how to improve those and connect with what the reality is on the ground. And we also work with Alula as well, which is a worker voice partner that helps facilitate work and promote worker voice. So just want to share that.
Yeah, lovely.
One last piece in this, which I guess is the pandemic presented a really strong challenge to business, but there's a bit more of a wave around all of it, which is that when we're talking about this topic, we are talking about progress. We're not talking about perfection. So this is a blip in the history of humanity, but actually what we saw in terms of the need for businesses to pivot is actually not too different from expectations now or pre-pandemic, that you need to be conscious of what is going on in the macro environment and responsive to it, dynamic, and focusing on how do we continue to improve and make sure that we have feedback mechanisms that ensure that our systems are improving with us over time and remain responsive is really important. Particularly here in Australia, we saw that shift from grievance mechanisms were whistleblower to grievance mechanisms need to be targeted to supply chain actors and responsive to their needs is a really important distinction that was made that I hope long survives the pandemic. So not everything improved with the pandemic. A few things did. I get more time with my little puppy at home. Not everything improved, but some things have really made a step change in this space. Back to you, Tanya.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, everyone. And just reinforcing collaboration is absolutely critical, and it is an iterative, long-term process that requires clear metrics to be able to measure effectiveness and ultimately to embed worker voice to be able to get that continuous loop. So thank you, everyone. And knowing that we've only got 5 minutes left, I think what I would like to do is to ask each of the panelists if there was one practical step, the most important from each of your perspectives that organisations can do today to be able to start addressing modern slavery risks, what would your vote be? I'll hand to you first, Patrick.
So one practical step you could take to address human rights risks, really, it would be spending as much time as you can having an understanding of just who your suppliers are. You can't do anything until you at least know who they are. Then you could dig into what are the circumstances of the ground, all of those different things. But first have that understanding, and also have an understanding within yourself that you as a buyer, I think we're speaking on behalf of brands most of the time, you as a buyer affect what the constraints are on the supplier. So if you're going to be incredibly rigid about pricing terms, then they might have to resort to less reputable means of sourcing themselves. So having an understanding of how you as a buyer affect the practices on the ground would be 2 of those points. Sorry, I gave you 2.
You are welcome to give us 2. Thank you. Indrani?
Yes, and I would say having a foundation and a data management system that you can trust, that helps you to collect and analyze that data, that is a prerequisite to me to be having any kind of impact that really is going to be able to allow you to set goals and go further. So one thing is really understanding the problem, understanding where you sit within that, and getting a better understanding of who your suppliers and where they are, but really being able to have data points, collect that data in a way that you can reference back again and that you can share with your internal team. So I can't express that more.
Yeah, lovely. Analysis paralysis, as we are absolutely in the age of technology, being able to have meaningful and credible and assurable information is really important to be able to inform decisions. So also to be efficient. So thank you, Indrani. Couldn't support that any more strongly. Nick?
Doubling down on an element of what Indrani was just talking about, which is getting really clear on the problem that you are trying to solve. So that is that contextualized risk assessment, but actually it's also taking a look at your own internal team. What are your strengths and weaknesses? What are the limitations of what you can achieve by yourselves? Do you have knowledge gaps? Do you actually need to bring in someone to do a little bit of the hearts and minds things so that you understand as a collective what you're trying to achieve through your supply chain engagement? And secondly, being really clear around the limitations of what you can achieve as an isolated unit and where you need to supplement that with partnerships. Collaboration really is the theme of today, making sure that the partnerships that you put in place are supporting your organization's strategic goals, including strategic goals as they apply to human rights and modern slavery.
Lovely, thanks, Nick. And I think maybe for me to close out, what my key recommendation is to build capability. It is complex. It's actually, it's a very scary subject. So providing your own internal teams knowledge, understanding, clear processes on what to do, what to ask with suppliers, but also extending that capability and your own knowledge to your supply chain. Small, medium enterprise are going to find this really difficult and challenging. So being able to share your own knowledge and potentially your own tools is really important. It's also lovely to be able to get that feedback and have continuous improvement through shared knowledge. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today and our fabulous panelists. It's been such a pleasure to have you all and to host you all, and we will send out the material post webinar in a couple of days. So thank you very much and have a great evening.